Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thank you for supporting this show, long-form content. The show's not called long-form content. Thank you for supporting long-form content in the form of this show at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. And we are happy to have back at a very exciting time of year, just a couple weeks out from the election, our friend Henry Olsen. He's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's a columnist for the Washington Post Opinions and the author of The Working Class Republican. Henry Olsen, welcome back to the news.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Always great to talk with you. And let's just start with where are we today with the presidency and the Senate? We'll do some rank punditry. How are you feeling?
Well, all of the evidence suggests that the president is going to lose. There are some glimmers of hope for Trump supporters that he is closer than many people think or that the national polls suggest. But the bulk of the evidence suggests that he'll lose, and it's not going to be terribly close. The margins that he is slated to lose by right now would definitely cost Republicans the Senate. But if he were able to close the gap by just a couple of points from where he is right now, it may not be the difference between Republicans holding the Senate or not, but it would definitely be the difference in as many as 4 Senate seats that would be create a vastly different Senate than if there was 53 or 54 Democrats than if there were 50 or 51. So even if the president were to lose, and even if the Republicans were to lose the Senate, what could happen in the next couple of weeks could easily determine the amount of wiggle room or maneuverability Joe Biden has.
What are some of the seats that you think are on the bubble?
There are a lot of seats on the bubble right now because of where the president is. The obvious seats that are on the bubble include North Carolina, the 2 seats in Georgia, the seat in Iowa, and the seat in Montana. Some people say South Carolina. I tend to think that the polls are overestimating Lindsey Graham's weakness there. But certainly both seats in Georgia, Iowa, Montana, and North Carolina are close enough that either party can win, and that the small changes on the margin could determine which party comes out on top.
Now, famously on election night 2016, you were tweeting, hey, everybody, Trump could win this. And you got a lot of pushback on Twitter. And then you ended up being
that.
Yeah. How does this compare to that? Are you more confident that Joe Biden will win than you were that Hillary would win?
Oh, much more confident. It was around this point in 2016 that I had noticed that the changes in Trump's margin with Clinton were driven solely by changes in Trump's support, that Hillary was not going up, and the Access Hollywood was the big reveal for that the margin widened, but not because Hillary was getting Trump supporters, because they're moving into the undecided column. So at that point, I was already looking at it being a very close race, and said publicly about a week or so before the election that was looking like a 1 or a 1.5 point Hillary Clinton victory. And then when I ended up crunching the numbers, I moved it out to being pretty close to exactly where it was. I was only a couple of tenths of a percent off. Right now, the differences are that in 2016, you had a very large third party and undecided category. We have a very small third party and undecided category right now. People are pretty much locked in one way or another, which means that for Trump to win, there has to be one of two things: either about 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 of Joe Biden's voters change their mind between now and the election, or that the polls are systematically off, underestimating Trump's support by somewhere in the 2 to 5 percentage point range. And I think both of those are unlikely events.
Why is that? Is it the poll thing? Is it just because you think they've learned their lesson in terms of the sampling mistake? I mean, I think last time that one of the big problems, I think they were undersampling college graduates. I think.
They were undersampling white college.
I'm sorry, non-college graduates last
Right.
time. They had too many college graduates in the sample.
That's right. They had too many college graduates a few years ago, and they've generally learned that. I think there is probably still a slight undercounting of Trump support because there tends to be in many states an undercounting of Republican support overall. But I don't think it's going to be in the margin that would be needed from where Trump is down now to bring him into a position where he can win. Um, so that means that the overwhelming thing that he has to do is move Biden voters. And that's something that he was slowly beginning to do before that first debate, and then it started to go south. Now, the positive news for him is that there's a lot of evidence from state polls that show him running much closer than you would expect given the national polls. In 2012, I believe that the state polls ended up being somewhat more accurate than the national polls, which had Romney running stronger. That may be a case again, or it could just be noise, but that would be one thing that I'll be looking at as I come up with my final answers in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, you mentioned that first debate. You wrote a column about it where you were very tough on Trump. I think deservedly so. Uh, why was that so important, and what was he thinking?
Well, it was important because what Trump needs is for people to at least feel okay, if not excited, about the prospect of 4 more years for him. That presidential reelection bids are almost always a referendum, even when they appear to be a choice, like in 2012. The fact that they've made it into a choice means that the voters feel at least weakly more favorable about the incumbent. So President Obama's job approval rating was slightly over 50% when he won re-election, with about 51% in 2012. Going into the first debate, Trump's job approval rating was inching up. He was over 45%. And had he continued that rate of gain through election day, it would have been in the range where a slight poll error could produce a victory. And he did exactly the opposite. His job approval ratings have declined since then, in some polls significantly, in other polls marginally, and we'll see if they recover. But what he needed to do was convince wavering Trump supporters and potentially wavering Biden supporters that they could trust him for another 4 years. And instead, he produces a performance that, for those voters, if not for Trump's partisans, was the proof of exactly the opposite. And as for what he was thinking, I have tried for 4 years not to get inside the head of Donald Trump and figure out what he's thinking. I only try and read his actions, because the former I can do and the latter I can only speculate at.
What do you think? So, do you think there's a scenario where Donald Trump could have become a very popular president and could be coasting to re-election? Like, I feel like, number one, I'm amazed that he's doing as well as he is doing. Like, if you had told me, let's throw in a pandemic, I mean, if you had told me all the stuff, and all the stuff that he has said and tweeted about people, and if you had told me that, I would say, like, there's no way he would even be in this race. And yet, you were saying that he was sort of tightening up before that first debate.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's almost like Trump has tried to lose. Like, anybody who was elected president would have said, how can I grow my coalition? How can I add in voters? And he has done the exact opposite. Could you envision a scenario where Trump got elected as this kind of chaotic disruptor, and then governed, and he would be coasting to re-election?
Coasting would be a hard phrase because there is such partisan animosity. The very thing that keeps him up in wave of time when you think that he might be down is the very thing that limits his rise on the other side. But if Trump had done what a normal politician had done, which is move, modulate their tone slightly, be more accommodating, um, I think he wouldn't be coasting to reelection, but I think he would be headed towards reelection. One thing we find in most countries in the world is that the incumbent, regardless of left or right, is gaining in most of the polls because if you put safety first and demonstrate compassion and concern, people will give you the benefit of the doubt for a few months. And I think had the president done what virtually every other leader in the world had done, he would be enough above where he is now that he would be the favorite. I don't think he'd be coasting, but I think he'd be the favorite. But the fact is, he did neither of those things. He did not modulate or show any degree of interest in significantly broadening his coalition. And then he did not do what almost every other politician in the world did. And so consequently, he is not getting the favorable bounce that others got. And what happened this summer with the racial justice riots simply compounded both of those errors. As it is, it wouldn't surprise me if he still gets 43 or 44 or 45% of the vote in the end, because so many people are scared of what the Democratic Party represents. But he needs north of 47% to have even a fighting chance of winning the Electoral College, and it's very difficult to see how that occurs without a massive slip up by Biden in the final week or so.
Right. Well, I mean, just even like the stimulus, a normal Republican might have had a hard time doing that just for ideological reasons. But Donald Trump has never pretended to care about debt or deficits. He doesn't even want to do entitlement reform. And yet here we are, theoretically, Trump could have had like governmental checks going out to voters right before the election. And apparently it's not going to happen. Like that strikes me as like the kind of thing, if you put philosophy aside, that would have been like a really smart thing for a populist to do.
I think part of that is there's a lot of blame to go around for that, which is that you have a very large resistance in the Senate Republicans to as large of a package as even the president has gotten it up to, and they're now talking 1.8 trillion or more. You had a very long Democratic intransigence where they would not budge off of their initial figure of 3 trillion. So you had this massive gap that was taking place for months. And now both sides are giving, and we may still get a bill passed, although we won't see checks passed. But I don't think that's solely on the president. I think there's a lot of calculus and a lot of ideology in play here by all people, not just him.
Oh, no, I agree. And substantively, I agree completely. But if you are Donald Trump and you're running for re-election and you want to win, isn't it the onus is on you to get those checks mailed out before Election Day?
Well, but we have a democratic system. What you're basically saying is that what Trump should have been able to do was cave to the Democrats and bludgeon the Republicans.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that about anybody who I think has principles or a philosophical reason not to do it. But like Donald Trump, isn't that what he does? Like, I would think that like, there's a maxim in politics that if you're going to get criticized for something or get the downside of something, you should reap the benefits of it. And this is one time when like it could have worked for him.
Yeah, I think there were some things that he particularly did not like. The bailing out of the blue states seems to be something that bothers him, not just Senate Republicans. And that's not something that even today Pelosi is willing to budge on. She does not seem to want any significant limitations on support for state and local governments that is contingent on some degree of prudent running of their own financial ships. And it could very well be that that's the thing that Trump has his stick in the craw about, which is let's help people, but we don't want to bail out these profligate cities and states. So yeah, it could very well be that there is an element of principle at play here on both sides, but just not the one that you would expect.
Yeah. Well, I think his principle is not to help people who are mean to him or he doesn't like or who aren't on his team. And I guess that's the principle, is to punish your enemies and reward your friends. But anyway, so I mentioned your book Working Class Republican, which is about Ronald Reagan, and it demonstrated that it really highlighted his populist side.
Hmm.
And you have, for years now been making this argument that the Republican Party really was catering to, in sort of a libertarian establishment that was out of touch with rank and file Republican voters. And you've been arguing that the Republican Party has to be a more populist party, but minus like the racism of Trump. And you think
Right.
that Republicans need to incorporate like working class Hispanics and working class African Americans into this coalition. And with that, hopefully I set that up accurately. I'd love to get your take. Where is that? Where did Trump? How did Trump do in that regard? And then, assuming Trump were to lose, who do you think might be the standard bearer for that sort of working class republicanism?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what Trump did was part of what I suggested. What I was talking about was adding to the pre-existing Republican coalition. What Trump has basically done is swap out elements of the pre-existing Republican condition or coalition. He has swapped in large numbers of traditional Democratic voters who are tending to be non-college. All the polls show that he's going to do better among Hispanics this year than he did in 2016. And in fact, there's a very good chance that he will do the best among Hispanics of anyone since 2004, including pro-immigration John McCain. Um, but what he's done is lost many college-educated, more moderate former Republican voters, and that's just not a victory. You don't win by adding 10 from category A and throwing out 10 from category B. The only reason it's anywhere near successful is because the whites without a college degree and some of the Latinos are in high electoral college vote states, so they're concentrated, whereas whites with a college degree are diffused throughout the country. So, one way to think about it is that Trump's coalition is effective at winning the Senate, but is non competitive for the House, whereas the Romney Ryan coalition was competitive for winning the House, but was a 50-50 chance of winning the Senate and had no chance of winning the presidency, whereas Trump's at least has a fighting chance. But so that on that question, I think Trump has done, kind of a C. He's pointed the way, but he hasn't delivered. As far as who, I think that's the battle that's going to take place. I think it's clear there's going to be somebody who runs to try and define Trump's legacy in a more positive route. And we'll find out over the next few years whether there is that constituency and how it responds. And that's one of those things that will also occur in the background of what's going on in the country. That if 4 years from now we are still dealing with a suppressed economic activity because of an inability to control COVID, well, people who will only put up with so much before they rebel, and they will rebel either by swinging hard left or they will rebel by swinging hard right. And that's one of the unanswered questions that won't be answered for many years.
What do you make of the current state of the conservative movement and the right in America? And I would include in that, like never Trumpers included, along with people who are, Trump's. It's a weird thing, right? Like we have people like Bill Kristol and Pat Buchanan, let's say, who both used to be part of the Reagan coalition and now are obviously very, very different. And just to use two maybe sort of extreme examples, like what's your take on the current state of the right?
Well, yeah, the right needs to rethink and reform. It's needed that for a decade. It tried to deny it. And Trump ran through that blindness to the nomination and then to the presidency. If Trump is out of the picture, that need is still there, but there's still a willful blindness among many elements of the party, just not as large of an element of the movement in the party as before. I think the first thing to understand is the conservative movement was always a minority of the Republican Party. That's something the conservative movement did not want to recognize, and it still doesn't want to recognize, but it is. And then within the conservative movement, the largest vote getting element of the conservative movement is the people concerned about religious liberty and moral issues, not the ones concerned about economic issues. That's another thing that people have tended to downplay. And I think what that means is a fundamental rethinking of what is conservatism mean in the modern age, and what does movement conservatism mean with respect to never Trumpers. Most some never Trumpers are simply, as Bill Kristol has pretty much acknowledged, he's not coming back to the Republican Party. Others are in that similar boat. Others will try and come back, and they may have influence or leadership roles, or they may not. But very few of them seem willing to seriously rethink, which means that they'll basically be casting in with what I call the restorationist wing of the Republican Party, the people who want to make a couple of bells and whistles changes, but otherwise want to return to what they envision the state of the party was pre-Trump. And I think that is a politically losing gambit. And so consequently, that simply would prolong Democratic rule.
Now, speaking of Republicans who could kind of carry the Trump mantle potentially, you recently went to New Hampshire to watch Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, at an event. Talk about that.
Well, I would have liked to have watched her. It's just that her suave Svengali, Corey Lewandowski, Trump's former campaign manager, kicked me out of an event that I had been admitted to because he didn't want to see let her be observed. Now, take that for what you will. As I wrote, usually when your chief strategist doesn't want you to deliver a simple meet and greet stump speech, that's a problem. I think the way to think about the Trump legacy is there'll be people who are competing for different ways to interpret it. That part of Trump's impact was personal, and you will see people who try and emulate that angry, drain the swamp mentality. I think part of his appeal, particularly towards the end, was that he was a unorthodox carrier of an orthodox message of republicanism, and you'll see people like Mike Pence try and do that. Both of those wings I call the imperial successors, and their basic mantra is more Trump, less tweet, even though they'll disagree on what the more Trump means. And then there are people who I label as the young reformers who will be taking a more substantive look. Says, look, what we won't need to do is downplay the personal elements and certainly excise any racially charged language, but upplay the way in which he was trying to define nationalism in a way that redefined what it means to help people in the 21st century. Those are people like Tom Cotton or Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley. And when you're looking 3 years out, one thing I know in American politics is the watts of the underlying factors tend to change slowly. The who's, the people who co-opt leadership of those factions, change rapidly. That, if you were asking me in 2011, I could tell you that there was going to be a strong candidate, trying to win the Tea Party phrase, in the small government, and particularly after 2012. I would not have said Ted Cruz would have been that person, but over 2013 and the first half of 2014, he made himself into that person. So I think the who will find itself.
Ted Cruz wasn't even elected until 2012.
That's right. That's my point.
To the U.S. Senate. Yeah, you would never have. You couldn't have come up with him.
That's my point. Is that we're talking here and on the eve of an election in 2020 about who's going to basically be national figures by the time of 2024, and There are some people who we can feel comfortable will be, and there will surely be people we've never heard of. Just like you mentioned Kristi Noem. A year ago, nobody would have said Kristi Noem, but the fact that she's done an excellent job of profiling herself as a new type of an old hard right conservative, and so consequently, she's getting attention. There will surely be people like that, much as Chris Christie got elected in 2009, and by 2011 was being begged by
Hmm.
people to get in the race to stop Mitt Romney because they thought he wasn't electable and Christie was.
No, Christie should have done it. As it turns out, he should have he should have run for it then.
Yeah, well, it's like I wrote in the conclusion of the Gnome piece. Shakespeare says there's a tide that runs through the affairs of men that, when taken at the flood, leads to fortune. Christie should have said, "I'm not ready, but this is my chance," and get on the boat while it wanted him. And there's going to be people who do that. They'll feel they're not ready and they'll pass their chance, and then there'll be people who will jump on and they're not ready and they'll go farther than they should have, but they'll sink anyway.
Yeah, well, but are you? I mean, Pete Buttigieg is a good example, I think, of someone who didn't win, but he did himself a lot of good, and Andrew Yang is similarly. Sometimes these guys don't really flame out; they make a name. Hey, I wanted to ask you about the Kristi Noem thing. So when Lewandowski kicked you out, was it because you were registered like as an individual but not as part of the media? Like, what was his rationale for kicking you out?
Oh no, I was clearly registered media. I had media on my badge. They had known I was media for an hour. What I think, uh, what they said to me was, "Hey, this is a closed event to the press," and it, said, "Hey, no, actually, the New Hampshire Republican Party told me it was open," and basically, what they made clear was that they wanted it closed, whether it had been
Hmm.
billed as open or not. And so consequently, I was not going to be permitted to watch her speak.
What do you think of this Hunter Biden New York Post thing? Is this going to have any legs or
Well,
not?
unless something else comes out, because we're just in such a state where if you're partisan on one side or another, you believe what you want to believe. That, partisans on the Republican side see this and say, "See, this proves to me what I already believed, that Joe Biden's family is corrupt." And Democrats look at it and say, "See, this is thinly sourced, it's Russian
Mhm.
disinformation," and so forth. There's very few people in the middle who will look at it and try and weigh it. And there's very few people who were the traditional gatekeepers who will actually try and weigh it fairly, because so much of the people who comment on these things are locked into those viewpoints. We've seen so many of these things over the last 5 years, of this outrageous allegation and this outrageous allegation, much of them against Trump and his coterie of buddies, but some of them against Democrats and Biden. And I think the swing voter has just kind of like checked out of that. It's now just noise unless there's some reason for it to break through, and it has not reached that level of breaking through.
Indeed. Well, hey, I know this is your busy season. I appreciate you coming on. So I don't think we'll be able to talk again, at least not on air, between now and November 3rd. Any final thoughts, things we should be looking for, thinking about in the next 2 weeks?
Well, you know, um, I think as far as looking for, you want to look and see where the president's job approval rating is at. That's ultimately a better predictor of where the president running for reelection is than the head to heads themselves. I think you want to be looking for movement, that if polls start to tighten in one direction or another, either tighten for Trump or widen for Biden. I guess that's what I should say.
Mhm.
I think you should be looking at movement, because polls always lag, but if there's a clear sign of movement, you should probably expect it to be amplified on election day rather than mitigated. I think you should look at the number of votes that are cast early. Right now, we have over 31 million ballots that have been cast. 137 million were cast. Well, I should say 137 million were counted for president. We know there are always ballots disqualified because people mess up their ballots. Um, there's lots of expectation that that number will exceed 70 or maybe 80 million. So if it reaches 100 million, that is I think a bad sign for the president, because it means there'll be unprecedented turnout that can't be swamped by Republicans voting on election day. And then I'll be doing some deep dives into data to try and see whether there are trends that are being underappreciated right now, such as Dave Wasserman wrote recently in NBC News that it's the Republicans are doing better in new gaining registrations in key swing states. That's a fact. Is that a sign of Democrats who voted for Trump re-registering? Is it a sign that maybe there's a ground game for Trump that hasn't yet shown up in the polls? I'm going to try and get to the bottom of that, and I'll let my readers know when that happens. But that's one.
That was going to be my next question, because that's the one data point that really is weird. I mean, it makes a little bit of sense, right? Because like the DMV isn't really doing a lot of business these days because of COVID, so maybe they're not registering as many people with the motor voter thing. Democrats, because of COVID, maybe they quit doing voter registration drives, and Republicans, since they're not as concerned about COVID, haven't pumped the brakes. But I mean, like it's a weird data point that contradicts everything else going on.
It is, and that's why you have to look and say, do you think it's signal or do you think it's noise? And that's why I'm going to try and get a read on it, because it could be an indication that maybe Trump really is. It's not huge, but usually registration trends are if one party is doing better at the polls, they will tend to be doing better on registration. So it'll just be very odd to see a movement to the D's in the polls and a movement to the R's in registration.
And as I think it was Wasserman who's pointed out before, there were something like 4 million working class white non-voters living in Pennsylvania who were eligible but just had never voted or were not registered to vote currently. And so is that where the registration's coming from? Like if Trump had a ground game to go out and identify these white male non-college graduates and get them registered under the assumption that they're going to vote for him, like that would be a pretty sophisticated thing to be doing. And man, that could be amazing.
And that's what I'll be trying to look at. I don't think I can get direct voter data, which is what you would want in the sense of being able to say, hey, are these people first-time registrants above the age of, say, 25? Just because when there are always going to be first-time registrants of people who age into voting, who obviously were ineligible to register before. But if you're above 25 or 24, then that's not an age in question or a returned from college question. That's a, hey, I lived here and I've decided that I want to vote. But there's a proxy for that. I'll be looking at registrations as a share of the voter-aged population, which in a place like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin is not going to have a whole lot of non-citizens in it. And if the share of registered voters is increasing as a share of voter-aged population in these areas, then I think that would be one sign that there is some type of a Trump-leaning ground game at work that hasn't been appreciated.
All right, so if someone's listening out there and their ears perked up because they want to know about this, it sounds like you're going to be working on this. How could they listen to your podcast? I don't know if you have an email list they could sign up for, or a Twitter feed.
Email list, but anything I do, I'll write for the Washington Post, and they should subscribe to the Post and get my work, which comes out every day, Monday through Friday, in the middle of the afternoon.
Awesome. I'm going to be glued to that. Also, they can follow you at what? Henry Olsen EPPC?
Yeah, that's my Twitter handle, at Henry Olsen EPPC. I retweet all of my articles, and I often tweet or retweet interesting election-related things that I'm seeing elsewhere in the Twitter sphere. So you can get your news from the nerdy side by writing to me.
Always a pleasure talking with you, Henry Olsen. Thank you for coming back on the news.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.